Hello, friends. I want to remind once again what the phrase means. The whole world is with us, which they love to pronounce in Kiev. If you look at the map, you will see that the countries marked in yellow are those that consume 3/4 of everything that is produced on planet Earth. At the same time, they pay in dollars or euros, which are not backed by anything, in fact, with pieces of paper that cannot be eaten, and the sanctions of which they apply to Russia today. These are not actually sanctions for 2014 for Crimea or Donbas, or for what is happening now. Sanctions are an attempt to maintain this same division into 3/4 of consumers and all the rest, who actually produce something. In fact, this is an attempt to preserve the same old world order, and Biden spoke frankly about this. At the same time, it is already quite obvious that it will not be possible to save it. And Ukraine in all this plays only the role of an instrument, and those who survive on the ruins of Ukraine are simply consumables in this battle. In their minds, of course, it would be better for them to surrender, but the trouble is that the puppeteers will never give such a command, and the puppets in the person of the Kiev regime believe that nothing threatens them personally. Now a few words about what is happening in the Donbas. First, you will see on the maps what was before the start of Russia's special operation in Ukraine. As you can see, the same city of Luhansk practically did not differ in anything from Donetsk then, being on the front line. Now the situation has changed dramatically for him. The city is in the rear, but the same cannot be said about Donetsk. But if you look south of Donetsk, you will see that the situation has changed dramatically there too. As for the center of Donetsk, the main forces of more than 40,000 troops of the armed forces of Ukraine in the Donbas, which is now systematically, although slowly from our point of view, are being ground down there. At the same time, they really have no way to receive replenishment in the personnel of weapons and fuels and lubricants. Meanwhile, in Kiev, mercenaries from the private military company Wagner were preparing an assassination attempt on Zelensky and Shmyhal. They wanted to kill our president and prime minister, an advisor to the defense minister of the Kiev regime told CNN with a tear in his voice. It makes me want to shout. How? Again? Well, there was a new summary of British intelligence. They write that they have imposed sanctions against a Russian manufacturer of Orion drones. You won't believe it turns out the UAVs in this war, they became the main weapon of Russian aviation because Ukrainian air defense began to shoot down planes more and more often. It's strange, but the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reports less and less often. We used to talk about dozens of enemy planes and helicopters every day, but only 3 were shot down in the last 24 hours. Moreover, as I understand it, the planes were personally shot down by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. At the same time, nothing is reported at all about the all-destroying power of Bayraktars, which for some reason, it turns out that Russia has become the main weapon. However, they are called differently. And in the latest report of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the main news is that the defense of Ukrainian positions around Kyiv continues. In the capital, the work of sabotage groups has intensified, probably those that attempted on Shmyhal and Zelensky. All enemy attacks in the Donbas have been repulsed, but taking into account the fact that such settlements as Avdiivka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk were not taken, it will be possible to argue about this for more than one day. The enemy continues to supply units with new forces and ammunition for return to the offensive, that is, it is recognized that after all there was some kind of offensive. And in general, I quote less and less reports of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine because that they are becoming more and more promotional. 80% of the information in of them are stories about how bad things are for the Russian armed forces and that Russia is constantly and everywhere stubbornly resisting on all sectors of the front. If you read these reports, you get the impression that the Ukrainian troops are advancing while the Russians are stubbornly resisting. Well, if we ignore the reports of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and move to the General Staff of the United States of America, then not everything is in order there either. It turns out that the Minister of Defense and the head of the General Staff are constantly trying to contact their colleagues, the Minister of Defense, the Chief of the Russian General Staff Shoigu and Gerasimov, and they stubbornly do not get in touch. Americans are offended, they do not understand what is happening. And everything is quite simple, Shoigu and Gerasimov simply have nothing to talk about with them. Do they have completely different specific tasks that they perform? In a completely different area. And Europe is less interested in Ukraine from the point of view of military operations and more interested in the economic consequences of what is happening there and the sanctions they have imposed. It turns out that Europe is on the verge of starvation and EU agriculture depends primarily on soybeans from Ukraine, which are used to produce meat for fattening animals. This is stated by the Austrian Minister of Agriculture. I will add that not only from soybeans, but also from rapeseed. At the same time, neither soybeans nor rapeseed are grown in the European Union for environmental reasons because they deplete the soil, but you can grow it in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a pity. I doubt very much that the European Union is threatened with mass starvation, but the fact that their prices will rise is beyond doubt, and they have done everything possible and impossible for this. Another interesting news came from India. The Minister of Foreign Affairs arrived there yesterday, China Wang Yi, and following talks with his colleagues and the National Security Advisor of the Government of India, he said, "When China and India speak with one voice, the whole world will listen." A lot of things are said there, but the bottom line is that those minor border disputes that existed between the two countries fade into the background. Now the entire Asian continent lies at the feet of China and India. Now much more important is the introduction of yuan and rupees as settlements in international transactions instead of dollars. Not only did they not join the sanctions against Russia, because they are well aware that in this redistribution world, their interests objectively coincide with the interests of Russia, and this once again will serve as an answer to the question of the position of those very yellow countries that we previously considered on the map. They are in very bad shape. The situation, because they are just the consuming side, and those who produce real products, not paper wrappers, are in that unyellow part of the world. At the same time, the same German Chancellor Scholz declares that Germany may refuse Russian gas faster than planned. Previously, optimistic figures of 58 years were called. I am ready to agree that if you eat less, burn less, drive less, if not keep the temperature in the houses above 16 degrees in winter, then at least it will really be possible to reach the figure in 5 years, but it suits us just fine because we already receive 5 to 6 times more for gas than we received a year ago. The situation is similar with oil. You can refuse it faster, but we also have a place to sell it later and at prices that are also already 3 times higher than the $40 budgeted in our budget. Therefore, we have enough money and we will not stop buying goods, those that we need with this very money, and we have enough of everything necessary for life, including gas and oil and food. By the way, we will sell food, and since prices have risen and continue to rise, here we will also receive the same super profits that we will need soon, but I will talk about this today in a separate video dedicated to what will happen in the ruins of Ukraine. And literally 2 words about what happened in Russia. In particular, the former commercial director of a joint stock company called Tactical Missiles Corporation was sentenced to 8 years in prison for selling parts of high-speed aviation guided missiles to Ukraine. I wrote about this a few years ago. This criminal case has been going on for a long time, but as we can see, this sale did not significantly affect, or rather, did not affect what was happening in Ukraine in any way. Neptune and Alder and so on, which Kiev proudly talked about for several years in a row, never took off, that is, they did not go into industrial production, and these single copies that were God knows where they were and what happened to them. And the most spectacular, probably news, from Europe. Spanish fishermen set fire to tires on a bridge connecting Spain and Portugal. Thus, they prevent the citizens of their country and merchants from traveling to a neighboring country to buy cheap fish. This, for example, is about what is happening in Europe now, and this is just a beginning. Let me remind you that when the pandemic began, you stole masks, protective equipment and much more from each other, closed borders, each country was for itself. Exactly the same thing is happening now, and will continue to happen, because as soon as a crisis begins, the whole unity of the European Union falls apart. Therefore, gentlemen, you do not look at that. What is happening with us and how hellish sanctions will tear Russia in half. We will deal with this as we dealt with everything before. You think of yourself, your shirt is closer to your body. That's all the best to you, goodbye.